If you clicked the link to this video, you're probably interested in programming DMR for ham radio. Now, you might be new in amateur radio, or you might just be new into the digital world, and let's face it, programming your first DMR radio could be a real chore. Today, I'm going to show you basic ways to get your DMR radio up and running for not only digital modes on repeaters and simplex, but also for hotspots and how to program your DMR radio for analog. Now, it is important to mention there are many different kinds of DMR radios out there today. I'll be using a GoCom GD900, but it doesn't matter because the structure of DMR and how it's set up is the same with any radio that you use. Let's rip the band-aid off and we're going to start programming repeaters, and that's the hardest thing. We'll work our way down into programming simplex and hotspots. But let's get the hard stuff out of the way, and the first thing that we need when we're programming repeaters is we need to know what repeaters are in our area. And to do that, I'm using a site called repeaterbookcom. And here I'm using their proximity search where I type in my location and I type in a radius that I'd like to use. And then, for example, today I'll be doing UHF because my radio only supports UHF. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to uncheck the mode FM and I'm going to make it show DMR only. And then what I do is I'm going to search and it's going to show me repeaters by distance. Now, this is going to be good for me because I'm going to get a good grasp of what DMR repeaters are in my area, and there happen to be a few. And where I'm located, I could probably only reach one DMR repeater here, and that's the Crystal Lake K9VI repeater. However, we're going to program multiple repeaters, multiple talk groups into the radio so you could understand how they all work. Let's start with the Crystal Lake one. And if you see here where it says frequency, I'm just going to click on that, and it's going to open all the details for the Crystal Lake repeater that has DMR capabilities. As you can see here, DMR enabled. And there's just about enough information here for us to program our first DMR radio. You can see here talk groups and color codes and uplinks and downlinks. Don't worry about all that stuff yet. I'll talk about it here in just a minute. I think the most important thing now that we have this information is to leave this window open while we go ahead and open our programming software. Today I'll be using a programming software for the GoCom GD900, but realistically all the softwares are very similar as well. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure we have a programming cable, which I do, and we're going to plug in our radio. With your programming cable plugged in, turn your radio on, and once your radio's on, hit read from radio. When you hit read from radio, you're going to go ahead and you should at this point, after a certain amount of time, be able to basically get a list of how your current code plug is or what's currently programmed into your radio. Now, the reason I mentioned that we want to read from the radio first is realistically, we want to save a version of our current code plug as the radio is in case we mess anything up. We could revert later to that current code plug. So go ahead and if you have the save file button here, you'll save your file, or you could always go to file and then save as and save it that way. I chose a naming convention called Original 010722, so I know that this is the original code plug I started off with today. And I'm just saving it in the folder where my code plug software is available. And you'll see I got file success, and what I'm going to do now is I want to create a new file or a blank file where there's absolutely nothing on the code plug because we're starting from scratch. Now, most people will be able to click file and click new file. And as you can see, though, I don't have that opportunity. And it just so happens that since I can't click file new, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click open file, and my programming software came with a blank or nearly blank code plug. We're going to go ahead and open that up. Now, I should mention if you don't have a blank code plug and for whatever reason you can't click file new, you should be able to go online, type in the model of your radio, and then type in blank code plug or just code plug and come up with some sort of result. As a last-ditch effort, you can go through each of these little menu items and you could delete all the information in there if you needed a blank code plug. Regardless, now we have a blank or nearly blank template, and what we're going to do is we're just going to go through and we're going to configure some basic stuff. Now, this tutorial, I am going to assume that you already have a DMR ID, and if you don't, I'll post a link below on how you could obtain your DMR ID. It's a very simple process. But what we're going to do is we're going to click on Basic Configs, and we're going to start in typing our radio name. Now, this is just a name that you want your radio to have. I'm going to call mine W9FFF, and we're going to leave it at that as that's my call sign. And then we're going to type in our radio ID. Now, this radio ID is going to be the radio ID that we use to get onto the DMR network. And if you've already got your DMR ID, you're going to go ahead and put it in here right now. However, maybe you've registered for a DMR ID quite a while ago and you just don't remember what your ID is. There is a solution for that, and for that, we're going to go over to this site, which is radioid.net. And all you have to do is type in your call sign and then hit search. And if you have registered for a DMR ID and it's active, you should see your radio ID right down here after you search. So we're just going to copy that or write it down, and we'll then go ahead into our code plug, and again, we'll type it into our code plug. Now, that's pretty much all we need to change, except for if you see something that says voice encrypt like I have here and it's enabled, you're going to want to disable that because encryption on amateur radio wouldn't be legal. Even though we could digitally encode a signal, once we set encryption, it allows it so other people can't hear it without that encryption key. That would be against the FCC rules and regulations. So I did uncheck the voice encryption, and I noticed my language was set to Chinese. I'm going to go ahead and set that to English. There are probably other options in here that if you chose to, you could change on your own. Doesn't even matter what Codeplug software it is, you should have some settings within your basic config to change to your liking. And again, I want to mention that the software might be a little bit different, so you might have to look in other places, but the key in step one is radio name, radio ID. Make sure you have that information into the radio. In just a second, we're going to start talking about zones, contacts, scan list, and channels, and we have to talk about them all together as we build the code plug because they're so closely related, so intertwined, that you really can't talk about one without talking about the others. But before that, I want to go back to repeaterbook.com and explain why I chose that site and why maybe it's not always the best site to rely on for information. Here on repeaterbook.com, I have the K9VI repeater, and what is great is I was able to do a proximity search like I showed you and find out that there are DMR repeaters in my area. But what is not always so great is Repeaterbook relies on people to update the site, and this hasn't been updated since 2019. Where that becomes a problem is maybe I don't have the most accurate information. Maybe these time slots or these talk groups, which we'll talk about in just a second, are a little bit old information or aren't accurate. But what is nice here is I have a web link to the Tri-State DMR, which K9VI is part of. So I can click on Tri-State DMR, but maybe there's no web link here. I could also just type in on Google K9VI DMR repeater, and then I see Tri-State DMR right here. This will be like a main representation of the repeater that I'm trying to connect to and configure. But what I see here is, first of all, I see repeaters, and I do get that information that my frequency is 444.80625, which was the same as repeater book. However, I will get some different information when we get into talk groups. But before we go that far, let's take this information and add some channels, okay? So we're going to go back into our software, and we're going to click on channels. And if you have a channel here already, you could delete it or ignore it. You might click create channel, and that'll create an individual channel for you. However, you might also have an option to add a batch add. And what we're going to do here is, if I have or you have a batch add file, we're going to click it, and then we're going to type in something like K9VI for the name prefix and then underscore. Now, how many ever channels we create, it will append to the prefix 1, 2, 3. So it'll be K9VI underscore 1 underscore 2 and so forth. And I'll show you that here in just a second. But what we want to do is we want to take that receive frequency, which was 444.80625. And we want to type it here, excuse me. But then, as I mentioned, it's a +5 offset, which means our transmit frequency would be 449.80625 because it's 5 megahertz. 449.80625, as you can see there. Now, how many do we want to create? And that's going to depend on something. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about talk groups. So the Crystal Lake K9VI repeater, we're going to have to remember this color code 4, and we'll go back to that in a minute. But we have the name in there. We have the receive and transmit frequencies in there. And now we need to click on talk groups. Now, the thing about talk groups on Tri-State DMR, you could see these are definitely different than the repeater book. So the reason I brought up this whole point is sometimes you get information that's not right, and it sure makes programming very difficult. In fact, so frustrating you might want to quit. But here we are back in the tri-state DMR, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to count how many different talk groups there are on the tri-state DMR talk group. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then various reflectors. We'll add one of those too, so 8. This is easy. This means I'm going to add 8 different channels here on my batch channel adding. So again, here, 8. Now, you'll see I can click OK, and it says that creating the channels was a success, and then 8 channels have generated. I'm going to now delete this channel right here. And when I delete that channel, now I have a list of my 8 K9VI channels, and this is where we're going to add what they call talk groups in. So in order to add talk groups in, though, we're going to leave these channels for just a minute, and we're going to click on contacts. Now you're going to see on the left-hand side where contacts is, I don't have anything called talk groups, and some software will actually have a section to add your talk groups there, but since I don't, I'm going to add my talk groups under my contacts, and in order to do that, I'm going to create a group call. In fact, I'm going to create 8 of them. The reason I'm going to create 8, just like my channels, is there's 8 talk groups that I want to configure right now. And easily enough, all I have to do is I have to go through this list right here, and I'm going to edit each of these to work for the talk group that I'm going to configure. Let's start here at the list, and the first one is time slot 1 and talk group 8. I'll talk about those in just a second, and it's called tri-state, so 1-8 tri-state. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to edit this. I'm going to call this tri-state. It keeps the naming convention the same as what they're using on those sites, and it makes it really easy to reference in the future. And then the code. Now, the code that they're asking for in my situation is going to be the tri-state ID, or as they call it right here, the talk group ID. So that's the code that I just put in, and it says it's on time slot 1. We'll remember that in just a second. But I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to go ahead and configure worldwide all languages, and that's talk group 1. As you can see here, this takes up more time than it is difficult. It's just more time consuming. And for worldwide 1, that's all I'm going to do, or all for all languages. And again, it's a group call with a code of 1. And finally, for the last one, it says various reflectors for XXX. And I respond down here, and it says the following default reflectors are active on time slot 2. Now, I could add, for example, this Illinois multi-mode link, which is 4636. I have to call it Illinois multi because I don't have enough space in here to write the full name. But again, it's 4636, and I click OK. Now, I think it's easy for people to start to become confused right here, so I do want to take another step back and kind of explain the talk group IDs. Much like we set up a radio ID which uniquely identifies us at the beginning of this episode, each of these talk groups are kind of like rooms, and they each have their own unique ID as well. So, for example, we are linking the talk group tri-state with its associated identification number of 8, and worldwide with 1, and so forth. And that's all that is. It's really simple. We have our talk groups that we want for this repeater and for these channels now put into our contacts. What we want to do is we want to go back to channels. And here we are back at channels, and we're going to go ahead and associate each of these channels with a talk group. And this will make more sense here in just a second. So let's refer back to the tri-state DMR again by clicking here. And each of these have a time slot, and we need to know each of those time slots. For me, it's easy. I just have to remember the only time slot that's not 2 is tri-state, and it's 1. But also I need to know my color code for this repeater, and you'll see why in a second here. So I just click on the repeaters, I go back to Crystal Lake, and I see that it's color code 4. Great. So here we are in talk groups again. We got to remember tri-state is 1. and jump into here, and we're just going to start modifying each of the channels from the top to the bottom. And the first one is going to be edit, and if you don't have an edit button, you might just double click on it. But I want to change the channel name to what the talk group is. And so basically what's happening here is I am connecting to the K9VI repeater. Through the K9VI repeater, I am connecting or associating into the tri-state talk group or where I want to talk to. So the thing that we had to remember was this was time slot 1. DMR has 2 time slots, time slot 1 and 2, and it's capable because it's a lot narrower of a signal than something like FM. But here we are in time slot 1. And then remember I said the color code was 4. If you don't have enable scan set up, go ahead and click on enable scan now, because we'll add a scan list later and I'll show you how that will all work. It'll save you some time just to check that button now. But you might think, oh, cool, I typed in tri-state, I have the time slot, I have the color code, I'm good. Now you have to affiliate this channel where you have the frequency set up, you have to affiliate it with that actual talk group that you created earlier. And to do that now, these are all the contacts you've created. So there's tri-state 8. Now what we're doing is, again, we're connecting to this repeater, and through this repeater, we are routing to that contact that we want to talk to, a group call called tri-state. Fairly simple, click OK, and then we're going to work on to our next one. And this is really where we set ourselves up for success, because if we edit this one, all we have to do now is just click on, first was tri-state, so next is worldwide all, and then just, again, change the name. We don't have to reference that website anymore because we've set up each of those talk groups under contacts. And again, we remember now that these are slot 2. And here we are now. We've set up each of these channels to, again, affiliate each of the repeater frequencies with a certain talk group. This is great. We're actually getting somewhere. And our next step now is to create zones and scan lists. So let's keep it simple and click on zones. And when I click on zones, I already have a zone by default in here. If you don't, just go ahead and create a zone. But I'm going to call my zone or rename my zone K9VI CRLK. And it just reminds me that this is K9VI Crystal Lake. And then I'll do underscore DMR so I also know it's DMR. Now, in that zone, what channels do I want to be within that zone? And this will make sense again here in just a minute, but the radio has multiple zones which can contain multiple channels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just select all of these here. As you can see, tri-state DMR is already in there because when the default zone was created, it needed something to put in there. But here we go, I selected everything as far as the K9VI repeater goes. And I'm just going to go ahead and batch add those files, and now they're in the zone. So we have our channels set up, we have our contacts set up, and now we have our zone set up. All we have to do is set up a scan list here. As you can see, again, I have a default scan list, which is scan list 1, and it looks like everything's in here. Now, one of the things I will mention, though, is there might be something you don't want to be included in your scan list, and just don't add it or uncheck it, if you will. So for me, in my scan list 1, which I'm going to call scan CRLK, something like that, or K9VI CRLK scan, something like that, I could choose what I want to scan in here too. And as we were to add more repeaters in the future with different talk groups and different scan lists, you could easily add those to different scan groups as well. But basically now we have just about everything to program the radio and see if it works. I do want to mention a few more things about talk groups. Now, I didn't want to show you this right away because it could actually really be more confusing if you see a lot more information. And one of the things I wanted to mention about talk groups in specific was just because you're on a DMR, tri-state thing and it says these are the talk groups and these are the reflectors you might talk on, you could actually connect to a whole list of reflectors here. As you see all these reflectors in the 4,000. So you could talk to your friend in Berlin, even from Illinois, or you could talk to your buddy out there in Italy from Switzerland. And this is important to know because just as we created all these different reflectors with the 4X and time slot 2, we could have added any of these talk groups as well, is what I'm getting at. So I just wanted you to know that now that you're familiar with what talk groups are. We now have one repeater program with multiple talk groups on our code plug. And this would probably be a good time to save your code plug. But not only save your code plug at this point, but also maybe even write the code plug to your radio and verify everything works, which I'll do now. With my radio plugged in and turned on, all I'm going to do is I'm going to write to the radio and it's going to say, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" I'm going to say yes, and we'll see what happens here. Great, it says that it was successful in writing to the radio. But now that I wrote it to the radio, I think the best thing for me to do is to go ahead and try to make some contacts and see if this will at least connect. This is W9FFF testing a new radio. Is there anybody out there to confirm it's working? And it says I was connected to Tri-State, and now I wait and see if anybody responds to me. Fortunately, if they don't, I do have a backup plan, being I have another radio. I'm going to leave this radio right here, and I'm going to go test this from another room. They're both hooked to the same talk group and repeater. We should be able to see what happens here.
This is W9FFF testing a DMR radio. Sounds like it's working. W9FFF, thank you. And I'll be clear.
Great, that worked out. I had one radio connected through a repeater to the talk group and listening, and the other one connected through the repeater and transmitting, and I was able to hear this signal from this radio transmitting, or vice versa. I do want to show you one other thing, though, and explain why it didn't work for me. If I fade over here back to the Tri-State DMR, which is what my K9VI repeater is going through, there is a toolbox in here that says last heard. And that's great. I can click on last heard, and I could actually see a list of all the last heard stations, except this doesn't always work, and my call sign doesn't show up in here, even though I was able to confirm that I was connected to Tri-State DMR. But now you've learned multiple ways to check to see if your radio is actually connecting to the networks. Obviously, again, the website, or you could check with two radios. And if you don't have two radios, maybe you have a buddy who could help you out there. Let's now add one more repeater and a couple more channels and talk groups so I could show you how multiple zones work and how we could use those talk groups that we just created in these new channels that we're about to create. I'm over here back on repeaterbookcom, and a couple of things. I see that it says Schaumburg's 8 miles away, which it definitely is further than that. I don't know why the math is off on that. However, it does show that Algonquin is also pretty close. And I'm going to use that as the next example because Crystal Lake and Algonquin are close by. And in fact, they both kind of run along the bicycle trail, which to me would make sense. If somebody who was using DMR radio wanted to do DMR while on the bicycle trail, they'd be able to program in multiple spots along the way of the bicycle trail and kind of jump between those different repeaters to connect to talk groups. And so here, if I click on 443.95625, the Algonquin repeater, I don't get too much information. As you see, I don't see talk groups here. I do see that this was updated about a year ago. So the color code is probably accurate. All this is probably accurate. But I go over to Google, and in Google, I type in WD9BBE Algonquin DMR repeater, and I come up with the Chicagoland Control Center. It's another network of DMR repeaters, if you will. So here under System and DMR information, I can click on Chicagoland repeaters, also Chicagoland talk groups, and get my information from there. We'll see Algonquin here, and the information all looks to be about the same. Sorry, I can't zoom into that very well. The Algonquin one, and again, the repeater is 443.95625 with a color code of 15. So that's great. We're going to keep that in mind, but also let's look at the talk groups and start adding these into the radio. Now, this is very hard to see. I'll go ahead and download a PDF and I'll be right back. And I assure you there's a reason I'm telling you about this. It's all going to fall into place here in just a second. So we have all the information for Algonquin. And as I mentioned, it's on a different network. But if we go down here and page down, we see that there's a time slot 1 and time slot 2. And if we read left to right, it shows us a list of the available talk groups within each of those time slots. So for example, I can connect to Arizona on the Brandmeister BM network, or I could connect to Texas on the Lone Star network. You see where this is going. But this is really what I want to show you. If we go over to time slot 2, you're going to actually see Worldwide English 2, which is Talk Group 13, and Worldwide 2 Talk Group 1 on the DMR-MARC network, as well as North America 2, which is Talk Group ID 3. So let's add all this stuff real quick, and you're going to see why I'm showing you this. So again, let's go here and grab the uplink, and then 443 will be the down. And here's what we're going to do. Again, let's go to channels, and you know what? Let's just do 3 channels this time, okay? And we're going to call them ALQ for Algonquin, or yeah, that's fine right there. And an underscore. And I said we're going to create 3 channels. And again, the transmit frequency is 448.95625. And then minus 5 is going to be 443. Great. Click OK. It said there was a success. And as you see, it added them to the bottom of the code plug list, or to the channel list rather. And now we're going to go through. And remember, I said it was WWE, or Worldwide English, Worldwide All in North America. Well, are you thinking, oh man, now I got to go into contacts. I got to add those contacts. Well, not really, because look, they follow the same convention sometimes, as far as things go. So look at Worldwide English is 13. So now I'll make Algonquin 9 WWE, and I know that'll be on the DMR-MARC network as well. But I think it said it was slot 2, and then the color code was 15. Well, cool, right? And then click OK. And really, you can continue to do this for pretty much anything. So Worldwide English, or North America 3 was one of them, right? NA 3, and I'll call that Mark just so I know maybe. And then again, 15 and 2. And finally, let's add one more here. We'll call this Worldwide All, I think it was. And it's Talk Group 1, and this is what I was talking about. And I'm hoping now it's all starting to make sense, but here it is. Talk Group 1 on the DMR-MARC network is Worldwide WW2. Worldwide English is Talk Group 13, and North America 2 is Talk Group 3. So the Talk Group IDs, again, they all kind of worked out. I might not be on the same network per se, but I am connecting to the same talk group names, which subsequently are under the same talk group ID, which makes it a lot easier. Now I have these under channels. Maybe I want to go into zone, and I want to create what would be my 3rd zone. I actually ended up creating another zone a moment ago off camera. Actually, let's just use this one here. I will create a new zone. And again, we're going to call this Algonquin DMR. Or maybe we would even call it Algonquin SCC, so I know it's Algonquin Chicagoland. And then we're just going to add these 3 right here. And maybe I'll remove this K9VI. Now, that's another thing. I'm going to show you one more zone thing to do here. But let's go ahead and remove that one. And now we have just Algonquin on here, which is cool. I'm going to delete this K9VI zone for a minute because I have zone 2 in Algonquin. And then maybe I want to create a zone for an area. Like we'll call it Northern Illinois, right? And maybe at this point I have a couple of K9VIs in there, and maybe I have a couple of WWEs in there. And we're just gonna add those. And Tri-State will keep in there. Or maybe I say, you know what, I'm going to call this one Worldwide English Groups. And I know that in Northern Illinois, maybe this will be Worldwide English and this will be Worldwide English. So I'll have multiple repeaters trying to reach the same style talk group, or the same talk group. And then again, I could make a scan list, but the cool thing is I didn't have to add contacts for each of those talk groups because the contact names were just roughly the same. So here we are, and we'll call this scan list 2. We'll call it Algonquin DMR. And again, these 3 right here, we should be good to go. So let's go ahead and write that to the radio, and we'll be right back. Okay, so I went ahead and I programmed all that stuff, and I think it's important now to mention a couple of things. Number one, if I were to try to transmit on this and be able to talk to the repeater and then through the talk group on worldwide, even though this is on the Chicagoland network and this is on the tri-state network, worldwide English is on a higher hierarchy, and they'll both communicate with each other. So I could talk worldwide English on here and here and on here. Another thing though I want to mention is right now each of your radios are going to have different settings on where to find your zones in your scan list, as well as how to change your channel. So I really can't show you that, but I think you're at this point going to be able to figure that out. But what I do want to mention is maybe you're going to test your newly put in repeater stuff, for example, Algonquin, and it doesn't work like this right here. It just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work for me is simple. I'm too far away. So that's something you might need to consider if it's not working is am I close enough to the repeater? And I even put on this big antenna here to see if that would help, and it hasn't. But maybe you are close enough to the repeater and you're still not able to get it to work. Take your time and kind of walk through the settings the same way we put them into the radio. This is probably a good spot for us to stop for right now because that is a lot of information I just gave you, and it gives you time to practice and write your code plug or start writing your code plug. And in the next episode, what we're going to do is I'll show you how to set up simplex DMR as well as how to set up private calls in the contact list. And finally, we'll wrap it up with how to program analog repeaters into your radio, which will be really simple. But I just want you to know that if you had any problems, just take your time and go back and walk back through it, and maybe you'll figure out what's going on. You might like this video right here, or is it right here? I don't know. But until next time, 73. Hey, thanks for checking out the channel, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it this far, I gotta think you saw something you enjoyed. Please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, which really does help me continue to grow this channel.